Chapter 648, Noon and Night. Whoosh, gasp. The loud panting sounds entered Klein's ears in a slow and rhythmic manner. It left a chill running down his spine as he felt an inexplicable sense of horror, but he didn't feel any dangerous foreboding. It wasn't only him. Katlia, Frank Lee, and the other pirates also heard the panting sounds. They either turned their heads, looked outside, raised their weapons, or were on high alert, showcasing their rich experience. After trying to discern the source, Klein discovered that the intense panting stemmed from the ruin ahead of them. It originated from a spot between the peak made of stones and stone columns. At that moment, bloodless Heath Doyle floated out of the shadows. He clasped his head and softly grunted in pain. "There's a corpse. There's a corpse there. Corpse, a corpse that pants loudly." Klein's thoughts raced. Katlia, who had subconsciously removed her heavy glasses and looked towards the ruins, had her expression suddenly turned solemn. She turned her head towards the pirates in the dining hall and said, "Quick. Quickly circle around that area and do not approach it." Her voice contained a magnetic allure that jolted everyone awake. The sailors rushed out of the dining hall and headed for spots that needed help. Under Navigator Ottolov and Bosun Nina's instructions, they adjusted the sails and changed direction, passing by the ruins from a relatively great distance. Only when the peak formed by stone and stone columns vanished beyond the horizon did bloodless Heath Doyle lower his hands, his expression no longer in pain. Upon seeing this scene, Klein narrowed his eyes. He felt that this Rose Bishop, the second mate of the future, might be a huge latent risk on this voyage. This wasn't because of his contempt towards beyonders of the secret suppliant pathway, but a judgment he made from combining the Admiral of Stars's description and how Heath Doyle had reacted. Just now, Heath Doyle was the only one in pain while everyone heard the loud panting. He instinctively believed that there was a corpse buried in the ruins, and Katlia's reaction after her observation proved his words. That means that even if Heath Doyle doesn't proactively listen to the true creator's voice, just by having the beyonder powers of a listener is enough to make him hear more than the average person and most low and mid-sequence beyonders in ordinary environments. Hence, he was affected the most and obtained more information on the danger when we encountered the panting sounds while being sufficiently close to the source of the sounds. Here, it doesn't mean that problems can be resolved by avoiding similar ruins, because according to Katlia, these waters are filled with voices that can make a demigod lose control, voices that shouldn't be heard. If Heath Doyle were to be in an inadequate or overly adequate state one day, he might end up hearing those lethal whispers. Similarly, even if a Sequence 6 Rose Bishop is inferior to a demigod who is good at listening, the gap can't be too huge. In terms of the die of probability, just 2 points, not 1 point, is enough to have Heath Doyle hear voices he shouldn't hear to go mad or lose control. I have to warn Ma'am Hermit even though she should have long figured this out and made the corresponding preparations. Klein retracted his gaze and heard his stomach groan softly. He had yet to have breakfast. At this moment, beer was splashed across the floor. Butter had been splattered everywhere. All kinds of food, roasted fish, toast, white bread, were strewn across the floor or hanging off of something. All of them had become somewhat dirty. It should still be edible by peeling off the outer layer. Klein looked at a piece of bread that was leaning on a table leg, in a dilemma on his course of action. This was at odds with Jamin Sparrow's persona. When he decided to wait for lunch, Katlia instructed the chef, "Prepare breakfast for the rest once more. Leave this to Frank, perhaps he has uses for it. For the rearing of monsters." Klein lampooned inwardly. After a while, he finally had breakfast which wasn't as sumptuous as before. It was a smoked pork sausage and 2 utterly burnt toast, as well as a cup of unsedated light beer that was treated as water. Due to them traveling through very dangerous waters with the possibilities of mishaps happening at every turn, Klein showcased his eating skills from back when he was studying in college. He only spent 1 to 2 minutes to finish the breakfast, just like he did back in his college's mess hall. He left the pirates' dining hall and came to the deck. He was having an after-meal stroll while also observing his environment. At that moment, the sea still appeared, as though it was illuminated by a midday sun as it was colored gold. Klein stopped and looked into the distance and saw a point of light ahead expanding. Under the sun's illumination, the point of light was producing coruscating, multicolored lusters due to the refraction. It was like a gigantic and transparent gem. As the future continued forging ahead, the point of light gradually revealed itself. It first parted before becoming clear. It was comprised of 4 gigantic columns made of pure diamond. They were like legendary columns that held up the sea. They extended downwards and stably stood there, holding up a sizable floating island. Above the floating island, the soil was charred black without any hint of greenery. In its depths, the lights had such an abnormal brightness that it outshone the midday sky. Suddenly, there was a long screech that was emitted from the island. It was loud and unrestrained, but it gave people a hair-raising sense of danger. Before long, Klein heard the galloping sounds of horses as he saw 2 steeds that seemed to be tempered from gold rush out of the floating island. Behind it was a beautiful chariot which was similarly made from gold. At this moment, Katlia's voice was amplified as she hurriedly had it resound in every corner of the future. "Look down. Don't look at it." Klein was never one to put on a brave front. He subconsciously lowered his head upon hearing those words and looked at his leather boots. He noticed that the sunlight which illuminated the deck was becoming brighter before it dimmed, and was rapidly restored to its former brilliance. "It's all right now." Katlia's voice sounded in the ship again without any obvious emotional fluctuations. Only then did Klein look up. He discovered that the 2 steeds tempered from gold and the beautiful chariot they pulled behind it had vanished. The diamond pillar silently supported the floating island as resplendent glows swirled around it. What a huge diamond! What a strange floating island! What would happen if I hadn't lowered my head and had watched the golden chariot charge forward? Klein looked around as he suddenly frowned. A pirate who stood about 7 to 8 meters away from him had already vanished. Standing there were 2 pitch-black footprints. Looking at the ashes floating in midair, Klein vaguely knew the outcome of not lowering his head. Thankfully, Admiral of Stars has been here a few times in the past. She knows what to avoid and when to bow her head. If I had hired Mr. Hanged Man, even if he was the one steering the ghost ship, we might have already been wiped out by now. No, if the future hadn't arrived at its destination ahead of time without giving me any time to prepare, I would have long sought out Will Ossipton's advice. A magician never performs unprepared. Besides, if I had hired Mr. Hanged Man, I definitely would have purchased the relevant information from Ma'am Hermit. Klein first sighed before recovering his calm. He didn't suggest visiting the floating island to explore it. He left the future to pass it by and head forward. In the rest of the time, the sea was like the outer world. There were only the undulating waves, the vastness, silence, and endlessness. Klein occasionally saw fire embers floating on the surface of the sea, but he didn't find any signs of marine creatures, including mermaids. Time ticked by, and lunch was soon underway. Just as Klein was about to leave the deck for the dining hall, he suddenly realized that his surroundings had darkened. The sky, which had remained in a midday state, no longer had any sunlight, as it was covered in rich darkness. This change was so sudden and fast that Klein's first reaction was to wonder who had switched off the lights. Silently, the future was covered in a layer of resplendent stars that illuminated paths in every direction. Katlia's voice, that contained a magnetic allure, was once again magnified as it resounded in everyone's ears. "Return to your room, or find any corner you can and make yourself fall asleep. Then, wait until you wake up naturally." Puzzled, Frank Lee asked loudly, "What will happen if I don't sleep?" At that moment, his voice boomed like a speaking bear. Katlia stood behind the window of the captain's cabin and said, "When we wake up, we will find you gone, never to be found again." The night here is that terrifying. Klein was curious, but he had no thoughts of attempting to stay awake. He returned to his room, and using the starlight which hadn't been extinguished on the future, he unfolded a paper crane and picked up a pencil to quickly write. What should be taken note of when traveling to the dangerous waters on the easternmost front of the Sanya Sea? Where can I find mermaids there? Putting down the pencil, he folded the crane. Without taking off his coat, he lay in bed and, with the help of cogitation, quickly fell asleep. In a hazy world, he suddenly jolted awake, clearly knowing that he was dreaming. No one is infiltrating it. Klein surveyed his surroundings and found himself on a mountaintop. Behind him and to his sides were black, cloister-like buildings. Ahead of him was a withered tree and a protruding boulder. On top of the boulder, Katlia sat alone. She hugged her knees and leaned her body forward as she stared at the mountain opposite them. She was still dressed in the black classical robe that exuded an air of mystery. Her expression wore an indescribable look of confusion. At that moment, she didn't move at all. It was as though she was a stone sculpture. Why is she in my dream? Klein took a few steps forward and leaped onto a boulder. Before he could ask, he was stunned by the vast scene before his eyes. It was a feeling that struck a blow to his body and soul. In front of the boulder was a bottomless cliff, and across the cliff was a mountain which was covered with countless palaces, spires, and majestic city walls. These buildings were opulent and stacked in circles. Just one of them was abnormally huge and didn't resemble a human's residence. Combined together, it had an indescribable sense of epic proportions that seemed legendary or mythical. The sun hung far away as it cast the colors of the sunset onto the city as the light seemed to be frozen. This is a dream shared by all of us. Katlia continued sitting there, hugging her legs as she said, as though she was in a reverie.